Okay, this is the last one, guys. I really appreciate y'all hanging in here for this long. I told you I'd tell you a little bit more about myself once we got to this point. So I'm a 96 graduate of Mississippi State. I'm a Mississippi native. I did several things that they told us not to do while we were in vet school. One of those is I married a classmate of mine. And I can only say that while she's not here, but we are still married, 21 years as of May. I did recommend that you don't graduate on May 13th, get married on May 18th, and then from there move to Logan, West Virginia 1 week after that. So I don't know if anybody knows where Logan, West Virginia is, but that's where we spent our first year together. It was a very, very tough year, and that's where I have to really be careful because that was our first year. It was not because of marriage. It was because of the area we were in. It's a pretty tough area. I'd gone through vet school saying that all I'm going to do is cows. My first job was 95% small animal. We lasted a full 365 days there, which was the length of our contract, and we got out as quick as we could. From there, I went to practice in Greenville, Tennessee, so it's the eastern part of the state, about halfway between Johnson City and Knoxville. I was in a 100% large animal practice, which I loved, ambulatory practice. About 80% of it was cattle, split between beef and dairy. My wife was in a small animal practice there in town. We did some sheep and goats, horses when we couldn't find anything else to do. From there, a lot of that, we ended up with 2 kids, and my wife said, we need to find something else to do, and I said, well, I'll start looking. AABP had a job opening at North Carolina State at the vet school for an ambulatory clinician. I had it pulled up on my computer, had to go out to do an emergency call. Came back, there's a sticky note on the computer, said you've applied for a position at NC State. You need to make sure that you have read over your resume in case they call. They say that there were other people that applied for that position. I don't know. Luckily, fortunately, I ended up getting that job, and we moved to Raleigh, North Carolina, where I spent about 10 and a half years there. And as an ambulatory clinician, extension veterinarian, and that's where I got to meet 2 individuals that helped me get involved on the grazing side, and actually 3. So Jim Green, who's an agronomist, forage specialist there that is now retired from NC State. Dr. Matt Poore, who's a nutritionist, was Dr. Mary's advisor during her time there at NC State, and then Dr. Steve Washburn. And Dr. Steve Washburn has just recently retired, and he is the grazing dairy specialist. So when I got started at NC State, that was really my first opportunity to be involved with grazing dairies. So we're going to try to go through and talk about a few of the things that are associated with that. And I'll be honest with you, before I got to NC State, really didn't spend much time understanding quite a bit, very much about grazing. I knew that the cows ate grass and that was extremely important. My dad was a county extension agent, and he made me in 4-H actually go through and do a lot of plant ID, so I spent a lot of time doing that. I had no idea actually how valuable that role would be for me in the role that I did while I was there. So if you have interest in that and want to learn a little bit more about these individuals or a lot of grazing management that is done on the dairy and on the beef side, you can do an Amazing Grazing Google search or look for the Center for Environmental Farming Systems, and that system is based in the eastern part of North Carolina. So you want to say, well, how in the world did you finally get to talking about grass? So has anybody ever told you how the difference between a fairy tale and a cowboy tale? So a fairy tale begins once upon a time in a land far, far away. And a cowboy tale begins as, no shit, this really happened. And this really happened to me while I was at NC State. I got a call from the zoo in North Carolina. and they said, we are having some problems with foot problems in our Impalas, gazelles, or whatever. I had no idea. I don't even know what they were. A lot of hoof stock that is on a system where they had about 150-acre pasture where everything was together. And I said, oh, well, that'll be cool. I get to go to the zoo. So I go, and of course, just like everything else, they put you in a truck, they drive you out through there, and they're looking, and they want me to tell them what's going on with these feet. And they said, well, it's got to be foot rot, but we're treating for this, and we're not doing this. And they said, what else could it be? And we're driving through these fields, and this is a bad picture because I took it after the fact. But the whole pasture that we were driving through was fescue. It was about this tall. And I said, well, it could be foot rot because they were running so fast you couldn't see them and the leg was up. It could be that they're foundered. It could be fescue foot. And they said, we don't have fescue here. And I said, well, we're driving through all of this fescue. And I said, that has been known to actually create some problems. Long story short, it was not fescue problems. It was a problem with the way they were feeding them. And I started going through, and I said, these fescue, they wanted to know more about fescue. And I said, well, it can cause problems in reproduction if they're similar to cattle and those kind of things. And they said, reproduction problems in cattle? Well, we don't have to worry about any of that. We're going to actually transition this, and we're going to put rhinoceroses over here. And they're actually more like horses. And, you know, they won't have any problems with fescue. So that is how I ended up getting involved in that, is that the rhinos were coming in, and it was a $2 to $3 million investment that they were putting into rhinos for a repro project on fescue. And that is how I got involved in grazing management. And I called Dr. Green, Dr. Poore, Dr. Washburn, and I said, I need some help. We are in really, really deep. And that's what we ended up doing. So they ended up putting in Bermuda grass. They actually have some black rhino babies on the ground now. But that's sort of how I got my start in that. That's a little bit later as to what it looks like. It's a beautiful place to go and look at. It's about 450-acre zoo. They have huge, huge sites out there for you to go around and look at animals that are probably not in a natural environment, but in pretty cool area. It's in Ashburn, North Carolina, just outside of Charlotte. So let's get started on the dairy side. There's a picture of Dr. Steve Washburn there, and I think that's what he's doing now all over the country. He's going around talking about grazing dairies. He loves everything associated with that. And then that's a picture of Dr. Matt Poore. And these are some people that he's doing with an NRCS grazing school. So if you ever have an opportunity to go and meet with them, talk with them, I would definitely encourage you to do that. So Dr. Washburn sent me this presentation and allowed me to use it. How many of you know Dr. Washburn? You may know. Dr. Washburn is a little bit different guy, and he really liked David Letterman. So this whole presentation is based on top 10 reasons why you are involved in a pasture-based or organic system. And that's the way we're going to try to do it. It'll be not as good as what Dr. Washburn can do, but we'll try to move through fairly quickly and get you all out of here on time. So big thing to remember for those of you that have not had any experience on grazing dairies, when you get ready to go into that and you are used to seeing Holsteins in confinement, total mixed rations and everything, really focusing on high production. When you go to a pasture system, that is a completely, everybody is talking in different terms and different thought processes. They are primarily, they're concerned about fluid milk production, but that's not their primary decision tree when they get ready to make things. And if that's the way you go about addressing those situations, you can have problems. The other thing that is very, very interesting to me is that cow fertility on these grazing dairies is really, really focused very much more than it is on any others, because they typically have a very tight seasonal calving season, very similar to what we would hopefully see on some of our beef cattle operations where it's a 60 to 90 day season. There's wide variety as to what happens, and I'll be the first to tell you that I think it takes an outstanding manager to actually manage a dairy. But to manage a grazing dairy, that is a whole different level of management, because you have so many more moving parts that you have to deal with. So not just the cows and not just the employees, but you have the weather, you have the grass, and all of that is changing on a daily basis. Some of the dairies are going to be pasture only. Some are going to have some supplements included. And this is probably the most common one that I see, is some type of a supplement included with the pasture, because of what Chris was describing earlier with the variation that we end up having in forages. The challenge gets to be, if it's an organic dairy, we have a little bit more difficulty actually finding organic feedstuffs to be able to make that supplementation. The other thing is, these cows are going to be pretty small in size. They're typically going to have emphasize a Jersey or Jersey cross or some other breed combination that typically we'll see there. In that particular herd, we were looking at cow size that ranged from about, the high was 1,600 pound Holstein. They didn't last very long in that situation, down to about a 750 pound Jersey, and they could have life expectancy of 10 to 12 years in some of those situations. So it's a completely different mindset when we start going to these type of systems. So number 10 is that most of these are going to be calved in 1 or 2 seasons. In some of them, they will do some bull breeding. In this, they actually did an AI system where they did tail paint. They checked heat once a day when those cows came into the parlor, and they bred based off of reading of those tail paint chalks, and that's basically their breeding system. They would typically have about 80 to 89% of those cows, depending on what the year was, pregnant within about a 75 to a 90-day calving season. Okay. Again, pasture is going to be the primary forage type. You get to learn a whole lot about that as those cattle are going around. They're going to do most of the harvesting. This is a alfalfa field that one of Dr. Washburn's graduate students had. She had a conventional, and she also had an organic one that was there. The herd at this particular system was actually managed organically, but they did not sell organic milk. So it made it a little bit different for me as a veterinarian, coming from a perspective of, we have antibiotics available to make some decisions. So they had major problems with alfalfa weevil in their stand, and they actually released an alfalfa parasite wasp to actually go in and destroy those, and use that in conjunction with grazing management to actually control the alfalfa weevil without the use of pesticides in those situations. So just so you know, there are other alternatives out there. It's probably not as good as using pesticides and others, but there are some ways of doing it. That particular parasitic wasp has actually was introduced in the 70s. From Italy into Utah was where it was first used, and has been used in a few different places since then. I really like this quote by Dr. Washburn. It says, pasture-based and organic dairy systems are elegantly simple but biologically complex. And that is really, really true when you get ready to go around and look. This was also my first experience in paying attention to dung beetles. At this particular system, they were able to identify, after very intensive pasture management, about 75 to 100 different species, is that correct, of dung beetles that were, I'm sorry, that's not correct. About 30 to 40 different species of dung beetles that were present on this particular system. So it was kind of cool to take vet students out and show them those dung beetles in activity. Again, the crossbreeding is very common, and it doesn't matter where you are. This was some pictures that were actually taken in Missouri. This is the herd where we did work in North Carolina at the research station there. You've got a little bit of mixed of all different colors in there, and you'll see the same thing even down in Argentina. This, on the calves, was probably the most interesting or the most challenging for me to get my head around. The other part about grazing and I've been in and out all day, that I probably didn't understand extremely well, is that grazing is a learned behavior. And if we were to take calves from our conventional dairy and try to put them into this system, as yearling heifers, they die. And I'm serious about that, because they do not understand the process of actually going out to graze. And this is the way that a lot of the grazing dairies that I have been on have managed their calves, is that they'll have these group feeders. We can say good, bad, or indifferent about them, but what they'll do is this one has little nipple feeders all the way around it. This one is feeding them in a trough. This is another one with nipple feeders. But the interesting part about it is that they would put these calves on grass at about 6 to 8 weeks of age. And sometimes earlier, depending on how much push they actually had from cows that were calving with hutch space. They would start them in a hutch and then move them out into these systems based on what the weather is. But if the calves were raised in this system, they learned how to graze, and there was no problem when they made that transition to a milk cow. Not the way on the other side. Number 6, the parlor is important, but they don't spend most of their time at the parlor like a conventional dairy. Want to use that dairy or that parlor for as long as possible. If it's available in 24 hours, they want to use it 23 and a half hours. When you start talking about these guys that are on the grazing dairies, they want to spend as little time as possible in there in the parlor. And on average, most of the people that I have visited with, at least twice a day milking, 2.5 hours a day or less associated with milking. And again, remember, they are using different measurements to determine whether they are successful or not, okay? But it's a different mindset and a little bit different one. We also see a lot of swing parlors. I don't know if y'all have ever seen that. So basically they'll load in one side of the cows over here. There's one set of units. They'll attach on this cows. While these cows are being attached, they'll load the other side. Once that initial group is finished milking, they'll let those out and attach. So the system just goes back and forth. Those of you that have spent time in New Zealand probably can explain a lot better than what I just did there. So I'm assuming that that's pretty common in those areas. The other part is manure management is basically they're not concerned about it, because most of those cattle are going to spend very little time in any kind of a confinement area, and about 85% of the manure that they actually end up or waste ends up in the paddock. This is probably the reason that I was not able to go and do a master's, because if I had had somebody to come and talk to me about trying to do this, I would not. I'd have rolled my eyes up and walked out. But Dr. Washburn found a student that spent 5 24-hour periods, and for every spot on here is either where the cow urinated or where the cow defecated over a period of 6 observations. So one 24 hours and one 13 and a half hour. I asked him why this one was not 24 hour, and they said they got tired and left. But what you end up seeing is that with good grazing management, with these 36 lactating cows, you've got manure and urine distribution very evenly across there, probably better than most people can do when they get ready to start putting out fertilizer into those situations. Now, you can definitely see there's going to be a little bit more around these areas where the waters are, but they can spread those out and make it very effective in using the nutrients available in that waste if grazing management is good. And again, this is another big part of it, not a lot of waste. This is where Dr. Washburn and I actually butted heads several times, and that is he does not believe in investing in things that rust. And this was actually one of his mantras, even to the point where we actually had issues getting a head gate on site. He said, I don't want to have anything there that can rust. So we were eventually able to get that in. It took about 2 to 3 years before we actually had a place where we could hold a cow outside of a head gate to breed animals, but you do need to be aware of that. Some individuals that are in this area believe that these animals are never going to get sick. They don't have to be handled, and that's really not the case, but that is another one. This one is a pretty cool one. It says you might be a seasonal pasture-based dairy if you prefer tree stalls to free stalls. And I learned something here that I did not know, and I'm sure it's just because I was ignorant. But if we put cattle under trees for extended periods of time for heat management, we no longer have trees. So because of the soil compaction that occurs underneath those, so when you start talking about grazers and cow comfort, that can be two distinct discussions, because the people that are the grazers are going to have that cow out on pasture as much as possible because they know that intake directly related to production. However, if it does get hot, those cows are going to want to try to find somewhere. So we had a lot of discussions about whether we should have shade there, whether we shouldn't have shade, how should we provide that. They had several trees there in one part of the pasture, and those are all gone now. This is pretty much what it ends up looking like. If you want to remove trees, that is an effective way of doing it. The one really cool thing about it is that we had very few LDAs in the 10 years that I was at NC State. We never diagnosed one. I'm not telling you they didn't have one, but we never diagnosed a DA while we were there, and we had very limited number of actual foot trims that had to be done on those cattle, because that's a big part of what they're going to end up doing is they've got to be sound to move. I don't know if anybody ever mentioned the term sacrifice area in grazing management. Did y'all talk about that today and I just missed it? So there's something called a sacrifice area, which was new to me. So when we are in those situations where we actually have environmental conditions where it's either a drought, really muddy, that may impact forage quality, or we may damage forage, they actually, these guys are pretty smart. They've designated a specific area where they will allow these cows to congregate. So there may be a lot of compaction, a lot of soil destruction that may occur in that particular site, but they make sure that it is only at that site. And then they may move that every 3 to 4 or 5 years, which is a really, really unique thought process when it comes to grazing management, which was a little bit new to me. And Mary talked about minerals. This was probably the part that we spent as much time as any dealing with. If you're interested in it, if you've ever made these, you can go to a YouTube video of Dr. Matt Poore, and he'll show you how to make those with his nephew. Low calcium was probably our biggest, hypocalcemia were our biggest problems that we ended up having in the vast majority of those problems, and I won't spend much time talking about that. Everybody's very familiar with that. But we did go through and actually sample some of these cows. And just to kind of demonstrate, these were 16 animals. Everything that is in red is below the cutoff of where these animals potentially may have problems. And our goal, according to Dr. Etzel, is to have 75%, is to have greater than 30% above our baseline. Okay, and you can see in this particular subset, we only had about 75%. We actually had 75% that were actually below that. So it is one of the biggest challenges that we have. I have not figured out a good way to do it other than through the feed or doing some of the products like Bovicalc or something like that as boluses. Some of them are doing IV calcium. Talked about a little bit about hypomagnesemia, and I'll just re-emphasize this. In these pasture systems where we're putting a lot of high potassium out, we are going to inhibit that magnesium absorption really, really drastically. So a lot of times dairymen are not going to be familiar with this, and we as veterinarians aren't going to think about it as a potential problem. But there is a formula that is available that allows you to determine, based on what the forage levels are, whether or not those animals are at an increased risk of developing hypomagnesemia or not. Other things that are important to remember is that when our rumen pH gets pretty high, greater than 6.5, we decrease that magnesium absorption, and we can get pretty close to that in some of our grazing systems. And also if we have a lot of fats available there, we can have problems as well. Sodium is a driver of getting that sodium magnesium pump, of getting our magnesium in, and we talked a little bit about the potassium. Ionophores, if they are allowed, will increase magnesium absorption about 10%, so that's an effective way to actually increase the amount of magnesium that we're getting into those animals. We do have to be careful about ammonia concentrations that are going to be there, because high ammonia will decrease that magnesium absorption as well. And y'all can find those fairly quickly online as to what those guidelines are. The really interesting part about the grazers that I have identified as we go through, and I'll encourage you, if you ever get an opportunity to do this, to do a pasture walk. For those of you that are having challenges with pasture or weed and plant ID, find your extension agent that is going to do some of these things, and that'll help tremendously as you get ready to go through and find those. So a lot of the grazers are going to talk about other things other than profit as the primary thing. They're going to talk about lifestyle, their ability to go and do some things outside of being in the parlor and milking cows. So other things that I've seen, and I'm still not sure whether I agree with or not, is there are some places that I've been where they actually allow the calves to nurse the cows. Some are only milking once a day. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't know how to answer that question, but just so you know that there are some situations where people are doing some things that are a little bit outside the box.